If you saw my last video about Rolling Stone magazine founder Jann Wenner's comments in reference to women recording artists and recording artists of color in an interview he did with the New York Times on September 15th, then you're well aware of how disgraceful those comments were, the fact that he was within 24 hours booted off of the board of directors at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame within 24 hours of the release of that interview. But a story about Bob Dylan's comments with reference to the Jann Wenner controversy seems to deserve its own follow-up, and I wanted to make a video just to address Pitchfork's speculative take on this, because they seem to pass on speculation as if it were factual, which I found to be problematic. Okay, so Jann Wenner, founder of Rolling Stone, quick review. He founds Rolling Stone magazine in 1967. He's part of the team that founded the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Foundation in April of 1983. All right, and he has this new book out called The Masters. The Masters: Conversations with 7 white guys. Bono, Bob Dylan, Jerry Garcia, Mick Jagger, John Lennon, Bruce Springsteen, and Pete Townsend of The Who. Okay, and this book became rather controversial as a result of the New York Times David Marchese interviewing Jann Wenner about the book, as I get into in detail on my last video. So I don't want to get into it and just rehash all of that here, but just in brief review, here's probably the most troublesome portion of that interview, okay? And then let's get into Pitchfork speculation about Bob Dylan's comments with regard to his old pal Jann Wenner getting booted off the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Board of Directors. David Marchese says this: in the introduction, you acknowledge that performers of color and women performers are just not in your zeitgeist, which to my mind is not plausible for Jann Wenner. Janis Joplin, Joni Mitchell, Stevie Nicks, Stevie Wonder, the list keeps going. Not in your zeitgeist? In part, Jann Wenner goes on to say a few things about this topic. Firstly, he says, when I was referring to the zeitgeist, I was referring to black performers, not the female performers, okay? Just to get that accurate. Insofar as the women, just none of them were as articulate enough on this intellectual level. Joni Mitchell was not a philosopher of rock and roll. She didn't, in my mind, meet that test. Of black artists, I mean, they just didn't articulate at that level. Okay? Listen, go into my last video on this topic to get my take on these comments. They kind of speak for themselves, unfortunately, for Jann, right? But Pitchfork puts out this story. Now, Bob Dylan addressed this. Bob Dylan is someone whom Jann Wenner has interviewed since 1969. Okay, these guys know each other real well. I get into that in my last video also. But Pitchfork puts out this story about what Bob Dylan said on this topic at the Beacon Theater show that he did on Thursday night. And the headline is Bob Dylan quips, jokes about letting Jann Wenner return to Rock Hall position. A 100% speculative headline, but passed along as if it were factual that he was quipping about this, as they put it. They go on to say in the subhead, during a New York concert, Dylan, who has a history of jocular onstage banter, we'll address that in a moment, said it's not right that Wenner, quote, got booted out of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Well, his full comments, this is me quoting Dylan's comments in full now, were as follows. All right, I'd like to say hello to Jann Wenner, who's in the house. Jann Wenner, surely everybody's heard of him, Dylan said. Anyway, he just got booted out of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and we don't think that's right. We're trying to get him back in. So Pitchfork says they reached out to a representative for Dylan to ask for context on his remarks, as the musician is known to banter playfully during shows. That's totally overstated. Bob Dylan actually is known for rarely saying anything at his shows. Yes, he does banter on rare occasion, this occasion definitely being one of them. And New York seems to loosen him up a little bit. The last time I read a story about him bantering with the crowd was about a year ago, I think last fall, and he also was joking with the crowd, and it actually was quite funny. But again, it's always very surprising, actually, contrary to what Pitchfork suggests here, when Bob Dylan talks at a concert. Again, it's rare behavior of his to banter or do any kind of talking with an audience, except to say, as I mentioned in my last video on this topic, thank you and introduce the band. And that's about all you hear from Dylan these days. There was one hilarious incident when Dylan got peeved. I'll link to this in the description, about all the people with cell phones in their hands in the audience, and stopped playing and stood up and said, if you want us to pose, we'll pose. If you want us to play, we'll play. And then all grumbly stands there and poses for the crowd for a minute. Then afterwards, he actually slips and falls on stage and picks himself up and gathers himself. So it was quite the tantrum by Bob there. But again, I mean, these are very rare moments. He is not known to banter playfully with audiences with any degree of frequency, such as Pitchfork suggests here. That's an overstatement. They go on to say, cite a couple of examples. For example, and think about this. Does the following prove with any degree of certainty that Bob Dylan was joking specifically about Jann Wenner, as Pitchfork's headline suggests? I would say no, not at all. Pitchfork says, for example, he said at a concert not long ago that Sylvester Stallone action movie Rambo Last Blood should have won an Academy Award. Okay, Rambo Last Blood got I think it's a 26% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. No, it was not a great film, and so Bob Dylan's comments probably were a joke, but do they necessarily know that with 100% certainty? Not really. Does it prove anything about the context of his remarks regarding Jann Wenner at the Beacon Theater on Thursday night? Absolutely not. They go on to say, in addition, one apparent attendee of the New York show, so this is a reference now to the Thursday night show that Bob Dylan did at the Beacon Theater in New York City, said that Dylan delivered his Wenner remarks, quote, with a big old grin on his face. Is that proof that he was joking about this? Well, it's interesting what Pitchfork says later in the story. Dylan's representative had no further context or comment to share. So they have no confirmation of their speculation from an official source. But they put out this headline, Dylan quips, as if it's factual. They don't know that. They have gotten no confirmation or context from a Dylan representative, which would have been an official source. So I find it all puzzling, but hey, let's say Dylan was joking about what he said with regard to Jann Wenner's disgraceful comments. Let's say he was. The problem there is that Bob Dylan owes an insurmountable debt to an innumerable assortment of black artists. I mean, you know, blues legends like Charlie Patton, Ma Rainey, Big Bill Broonzy. Then there's Chuck Berry and Little Richard, who were huge influences on Dylan and many from his generation. You think about like Lightnin' Hopkins and Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf. Howlin' Wolf there he is. There's my man Howlin' Wolf. It's an interesting example because I have the box set of all of Howlin' Wolf's stuff. Okay, this is his 71 historic performances from 1951 to 1973. It is one of those killer chess box sets of a blues legend like Howlin' Wolf. Okay, I've got the Muddy Waters, I've got the Chuck Berry chess box set, but this Howlin' Wolf I mentioned because think about Jann Wenner's comments that apparently black artists are not articulate enough to be considered as intellectual equals of his. With the fact that there are 4 segments on here called Howlin' Wolf Talks, and I have always found those 4 segments on here where it's no music, it's just Howlin' Wolf telling stories of his life, his background before and during his time as one of the most treasured blues artists in American history, probably still to this day the greatest blues vocalist we've ever had. These stories that he tells, these snippets of Howlin' Wolf interviews, are among the most riveting moments on this box set. Listen to them for yourself. Maybe pull this stuff up on Spotify and just listen to those segments. And again, as I mentioned over and over in my last video on this topic, Jann Wenner is telling us that Howlin' Wolf, who died in 1976, so there was abundant opportunity between Rolling Stone magazine's founding in 1967 and Howlin' Wolf's death in 1976 for Jann to go ahead and sit Howlin' Wolf down and have a nice talk with Howlin' Wolf about blues and rock and roll history, the influence of blues on rock and roll. It would have been easy to sit down with Howlin' Wolf for a good 7 or 8 hours, and that is not an exaggeration about this legendary, fascinating man's life. So for Bob Dylan to even joke about something like this. When he owes this debt to these black artists, when he owes such debt to female performers, such as in particular Joan Baez, who was a huge influence on Dylan early on in his days as a folk performer, who toured with Bob into the 1970s with his Rolling Thunder Revue. For Dylan to joke about these reprehensible comments, if in fact that's what he was doing, we don't know that. Pitchfork misguidedly puts this notion out there as if it were factual when they know, as their story confirms, that it is not. We're not sure that he was joking or actually genuinely defending Jann, which he may well have been doing. Again, he and Jann go way back, right? For him to joke about Jann's comments regarding black and female artists is puzzling, because of all of the debts that Dylan owes the very artists that Jann Wenner's comments sweepingly and in this astonishingly, breathtakingly generalized fashion just summarily dismiss. The 4 white men the 7 white men that I listed in his book are the ones that he brands as masters. And then when women and black artists come up in this interview with New York Times, he says none of them were articulate enough, or they weren't philosophers of rock and roll. It's balderdash. It's utter nonsense, and it's such an embarrassment for a man who has really held some serious power and clout within the rock business for many decades now. A guardian at the gates of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, who would gloat about, when he was chairman of the board at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Foundation, how powerful that made him. And look at how flimsy that power turned out to be, because as I mentioned on my last video, it took the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Board of Directors a mere 20 minutes to vote his butt off of that body after he made these comments in the New York Times. Okay? So I think the lesson for Bob might be this. If you're not prepared to acknowledge the obvious with regard to this topic, which is that Jann Wenner's comments were reprehensible and indefensible, then just say nothing about it. You go ahead and move on with your so-called never-ending tour, Bob. Let Jann move on with his life and figure out what that's going to be about now that he's disgraced himself at age 77 after a lifetime building his profile in the business that he served for so long. And leave it at that. If his comments were joking, it's puzzling at best. I don't understand it, and it's in rather poor taste. If his comments were in fact defending Jann, that too is in poor taste. It's a no-win situation here for anyone, Bob Dylan or otherwise, to have anything to say about this except rebuke. Because that's what these comments deserve, especially from an artist like Bob, whose influences are laden with the very kinds of artists that Jann Wenner's comments impugn.